Ladies and gentlemen, I am Arié Bensemoun, the CEO of Elnet in France. Thank you for joining our leadership training seminar. Before starting, I would like to inform you that you can write your question to the speakers in the chat box, and we will bring them to their attention during the Q&A session. A few months ago, Elnet and thinc have decided to make a partnership and offer a 5-part course to all the people and organizations which advocate for Israel. I would like to thank my friends Andrew Tucker and Peter Ugendorn for their great work and collaboration. With this educational program entitled Israel on Trial, our goal is to back to basics, to give you keys of understanding of the misuse of history and international law to isolate and delegitimate Israel. After discussing the UN, international law, and issues of legitimacy last September, we will tackle today historical issues for the second session. And the question is, what is the Jewish state of Israel? Very important question indeed. How, when, and why did the Jewish state of Israel come into existence? Was the creation of the state of Israel an example of colonialism or decolonization? What does international law say about the legitimacy of the state of Israel? How is the Jewish character of the state expressed, and in what way is Israel a democracy? Do Israel, Arabs, and Jews have equal rights? And many other questions. To discuss all the parameters of this topic, we'll have the pleasure to welcome 3 very important speakers: Dr. Mati de Blois, Senior Fellow at thinc, Professor Amichai Cohen, Senior Fellow at Israel Democracy Institute, and Itzhak Sokolov, founder and CEO of Keshet Educational Journeys. I wish to all of us a successful meeting, and Andrew, the floor is yours to introduce our session. Thank you.
Thank you, Arié, and welcome everybody. It's so good to see so many people from so many different parts of the world. So thank you for joining in. I know some of you are down under where it's pretty late in the evening, so I hope you can stay awake for this session, which I think is going to be a very exciting session. Those of you who were with us last time, a few weeks ago in our first session, we talked about what is international law. And one of the things that we discussed was the status of UN resolutions. And the point was made that the United Nations is basically a political body, and the resolutions that are passed by the General Assembly are not binding instruments of law. There might be evidence of law, but they're not in themselves binding. In fact, most Security Council resolutions are also not binding international law. Law is made up of custom and treaties. And that provides the basis, I think, for our discussions in future sessions, where we're going to talk more about lawfare and the use and misuse of law against Israel, especially now 70 years after the creation of the State of Israel. But in order to get there, we wanted to spend a session talking about the State of Israel itself, because it's subject to criticism and condemnation today more than it's ever been before. The State of Israel was created in 1948, May 1948. And since 1967, since it captured the territories, as we know, in the Six-Day War, what is now known as the West Bank and East Jerusalem and Gaza, also the Golan Heights, and of course it captured much more territory than that. Israel's presence in those territories, the so-called occupation, has been very controversial. Israel has been called increasingly to withdraw from the territories, to end its military and civil administration. But the establishment of a Palestinian state has been very controversial and still has not yet happened. That's another topic we will talk about next week. But today we're going to talk about something even more fundamental than the territories. The very existence of the Jewish state of Israel is increasingly being challenged. And what I mean by that is the legitimacy the very right of the state to exist as a Jewish state is being questioned. It's always been questioned, but the questioning has become much more mainstream than ever before. It seems we're in a kind of a new phase of the history of the state of Israel. One of the most potent examples of this was the report published last April by Human Rights Watch entitled "A Threshold Crossed: Israeli Authorities and the Crimes of Apartheid and Persecution." Now, according to Human Rights Watch, Israel is methodologically privileging Jewish Israelis while repressing Palestinians, most severely in the occupied territory, but also in Israel itself, that is, within the Green Line, leaving aside East Jerusalem for a moment, which is disputed, but Israel regards as part of the state of Israel. So today we're going to take a step back and we're going to think about what is the Jewish state, what is Zionism, the movement that led Jews from all over the world to come back to the land of their forefathers from the mid-19th century onwards, and led to the creation of the State of Israel in May 1948. And still Jews are returning from the four corners of the globe in response to the calling that underlies the movement known as Zionism. So what is Zionism? And is the State of Israel inherently racist or discriminatory against non-Jews? Well, I can't imagine anyone more qualified to speak to these issues than the three speakers we have today. Our first speaker, Yitzhak Sokolov, is going to share with us about Zionism, what it means to reestablish a Jewish homeland. And he's going to share about the Zionist movement. He'll be followed by Dr. Matthijs de Blois, who will talk about how the State of Israel came into existence in the period from the First World War up until 1948. And then we're very privileged to have Professor Amichai Cohen, who will talk with us about the Jewish state itself and issues of discrimination or non-discrimination. So Yitzhak Sokolov, our first speaker, is an Israeli educator and political analyst. He's a graduate of Columbia University. He taught political science and Jewish philosophy at the Hebrew University and served in the IDF and at the Prime Minister's office. He's affiliated with Bar Ilan University as a Renat Fellow for Jerusalem Studies, and he is the founder and president of Keshet Educational Journeys. And it's been our privilege to work with Yitzhak, especially when bringing people to Israel to discover what is Israel. There's no better person to have than Yitzhak to guide you. So Yitzhak, welcome. Thank you for joining us from America, I think, at the moment. You're on mute. Oh, look at that. You need to unmute yourself, Yitzhak.
All right, I have unmuted.
Oh, you're brilliant. Okay, so we have connection.
Very nice. And I'm currently sitting on the 48th floor of a building overlooking all of Manhattan and beneath me, and enjoying the fact that we can all speak from around the world at the same time.
Terrific. So Yitzhak, the floor is yours to share with us about Zionism.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It's nice to be back. I've had the pleasure of joining thinc in different venues, once in The Hague, in Den Haag a number of years ago, once in Prague, and a few times on Zoom in different locations. And it's wonderful to be with a community of people who share our vision of a Jewish state that lives freely, independently, and with a sense of justice in terms of how it struggles with the dilemmas that we must face every day. And those who are equally concerned about what's happened recently in the international community, and essentially the hijacking of the word racism or apartheid in the case of the Human Rights Watch and other organizations, in order to describe the national liberation movement of the Jewish people. We live in very, very strange times. as we speak, thousands of individuals are attempting to get into Europe or the United States. Many of them drown in the Rio Grande River between the United States and Mexico or in the Mediterranean. They are, by and large, browner or blacker than the residents of the countries, or the majority of the residents of the countries that they're trying to get into. But the fact that they have to go through such hell is not described by the international community as a problem of racism. Human Rights Watch doesn't argue that there should be free immigration around the world. On the contrary, it defends the rights of economic entitlement of established, well-off countries to maintain that. Which is strange, because the passion with which attacks are being made on Israel today brings to mind some very difficult periods of our history and of human history. I think what I like to do is to start by sharing an incident that took place for me about 20 years ago at Harvard University, when I had come from Israel to speak to the community there after the battles in Jenin. And at the time, Israel was under attack for defending itself in the course of the Second Intifada. It was not self-evident that our defense of ourselves was legitimate. And I was asked to speak to a couple of hundred students. So I got up and tried to explain the dilemmas of our policy and what it meant to be fighting against an enemy that was resolved to use terror and suicide bombs and whatnot in order to bring us to our knees. At one point, it was impossible to to talk to the community. There was a tremendous amount of yelling and screaming, and the students were already in the mode of refusing to listen. And I took the opportunity to say that I brought with me representatives of the Palestinian side of the equation as well. And I put into what is then a VCR, for those of you who remember, a video, which described, it didn't describe, it showed in graphic terms sermons taking place in Gaza, in Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, of Muslim clergymen calling for the destruction of Israel, saying that there would never be peace unless Ramla and Lud and Tel Aviv and Jaffa returned to Palestinian control, and justifying the use of wholesale terror against the civilian population. That, for some reason, made it possible for me to sort of have a moment of respite when I said, what would you have us do given the realities that we live in? And I think we should remember, whenever we think about things like the Human Rights Watch or the arguments of apartheid, the question is always, what would you have us do given the context, given the realities that we live in? The 167-page document put out by Human Rights Watch attacking Israel never once paused to ask the question of, what would you have us do given the realities of the situation that we lived in? I'll get back to that. But at Harvard at the time, I remember a young Palestinian raised his hand. All of a sudden it was quiet. I was able to take questions. And he said, I don't understand one thing, sir. You, the Jews, are a religion. We, the Palestinians, are a nationality. As a nationality, we are entitled to territory, to the control of territory. You, as a religion, are not. There are no religious states in the world other than the Vatican. All other states are political, territorial, and based on nationhood, not on religious faith. You, as the representative of the Jews here, are religion, but you should not have rights to territory. Palestine is ours. So I thought about how to respond. And, I think we would all think about how to do that. I said at the time, imagine for a minute you're speaking to someone from China, from India, from Persia, from Egypt, ancient peoples, thousands of years old, who see themselves as nations, in using a definition that predates European nationalism by some 2,000 years. A group of people who come together because of a connection to each other, to a common vision, to a language, to a territory. Jews are part of that pretty exclusive club. So when you say to me, you Jews are a religion, what you're doing is using a sociological argument produced in Western countries in Europe to define their Jewish minorities in a way that they found comfortable, which stripped of the Jews the right of defining themselves. We have, I said, been defining ourselves for the last 3,000 years as a people, which does not mean to say that you Palestinians don't have the same right to begin now in this century to define yourselves as a people, but we are not going to say that you can tell us that we therefore have no rights. Now, the argument over whether Judaism is a religion or a nation, or today, whether Jewish national self-fulfillment is considered to be racial or racist, is an old argument. It's been around for a long time. Today, it's much more potent in many ways. But that I think that that's sort of the starting point for this conversation, to understand Zionism is not used the language, I would say, of 19th century European nationalism after an awakening of nationalist groups in Europe, in Italy, Germany, France, later on in Eastern Europe, Central Europe. It used that language because it was understandable to Europeans. But ultimately, to argue that Zionism is racism is to argue that Judaism is racism. And to argue that maybe that any national self-identity is racism whatsoever, any distinction between peoples. If we looked for the origins of a concept of the Jews as a people, we need to go no further than the Bible itself, which speaks about God speaking to Abraham that he should get up and go to the land of Israel to create a nation which will be of a blessing to the earth. He himself does not create that nation. He creates a group of families based on himself and his wife and what the Bible says, the souls that he did in Haran. That, in other words, non-Jews, non-family members who were added to this community. Moses takes up the gauntlet that Abraham laid, takes the Jewish people out of Egypt, forming them as a nation, not within the context of a territory, but within the context of a group of people who share a common faith, a common vision, and ultimately reach the land of Israel in order to fulfill that vision. To fulfill it, in this case, the vision, I would say, comes down in a nutshell to that of creating a society that is both holy and just. And the national dialectic of ancient Jewish history was always seen to be, would the Jews succeed in creating a just society in the land of Israel? You needed to be in the land, you needed to have a political entity in order to live with those values. They weren't values to preach, they were values to act upon. You could only act upon those values were there to be sovereignty. But it was never clear that the Jewish people would remain in the land of Israel were they not. On the contrary, it was clear according to the prophets that they would not remain in the land of Israel were they not to pursue justice, as is cited in the book of Deuteronomy. And when one thinks about it, the fact that Jews remain a group of people with a connection to each other, who share common memories, common dreams, common prayers, and a common language, and hold on to those prayers throughout 2,000 years of exile is a rather unique experience in human history. There are no other examples of a group of people who are not defined by their color or by their appearance who maintained the ability to project their presence into history, into the future, and to once again, 2,000 years after losing sovereignty, to return as actors in history. It's an amazing, amazing story. But I think we should realize that the focal point of Jewish national vision was to create a society that shared those elements of holiness on the one hand and of justice on the other. Was this a racial concept? Well, we only, again, go to the biblical story, which is the one, irrespective of its historical accuracy, is what framed Jewish consciousness for the last several thousand years. It begins with Abraham adding other people from his community, and it includes Moses leaving Egypt with the group of people called the Erev Rav, the multitudes of non-Jews, those who are not part of the patriarchal society of tribes who put their own history back to the land of Israel, but Egyptians who came with them into Sinai and become Jews. Ironically, you could almost compare this to Islam, in which if we were to repeat the Shahada, the phrases of loyalty to Islam and Muhammad as the prophet a number of times, we would become Muslims no less than any other Muslim. Islam and Judaism are religions that are based on national visions, but certainly not racial ones. In the 19th century, Zionism uses the language to Jews. It speaks in the language of traditional Jewish self-understanding. We have the opportunity to move back to the land of Israel, to establish a world as of old, to once again confront that biblical challenge of creating a just society, which requires us to be sovereign. And in its dialogue with the rest of the world, use the language of 19th century European nationalism to speak about the rights of peoples to independence, to freedom, to safety. There were different foci or emphases of Zionism. One difference was that those between those who said that living in Europe is simply not safe for Jews anymore, if it has ever been. And therefore, we need to remove the Jews to a different domain, that being the land of Israel. Those who said we can't be normal human beings because in order to live normally, we need to live with the ability of expressing our own faith and our own national ethos. And for that, we require the possibility of returning to the land of Israel. Part of that national ethos also related to the question of how one lives with non-Jews. It's true that the initial Zionist movement did not see the hundreds of thousands or perhaps a million Palestinian Arabs, as today we call them, living in the land of Israel as a major challenge, because they felt that they were speaking in the name of up to 15 million Jews who would create a Jewish society in which the non-Jewish elements would be a tiny minority and therefore able easily to receive absolute and complete equal rights. And that was the concept, the way that in Sweden, or 12% of the population are Finns, or in Finland, 12% are Swedes, I don't remember. And there are no issues of national rights, but there are issues of human rights, and everyone receives the same human rights. That was the concept of Herzlian Zionism and of most of Zionism in the 19th, going into the beginning of the 20th century, where it became clear that it was not going to be possible for the Arabs living in the land of Israel to accept the fact that they'd be living in a Jewish environment, in a Jewish sovereign state. Because while the Jews were listening to the voices of Western national self-determination and nationalism, and paying attention to what was happening in Versailles after the First World War and the concept of self-determination, so were the Arabs. And the Arabs argued that they too have national rights. And the question was, who defines them? From the Arab perspective, European involvement in defining their own rights was something that they found hard and continue to find hard to understand. But what we saw then was, beginning with Churchill in 1922, that partition became a paradigm with which to address the question of how does one preserve the national political rights of Jews and the national political rights of Arabs. As Arab consciousness began to develop, it moved from the general Arab people to subgroups, Syrians, Lebanese, Iraqis, Palestinians, even Jordanians, who initially did not have a national identity at all, but were a country that was formed by Great Britain for its own imperialist reasons. All of these places developed classical concepts of political nationalism. Partition has been on the table since 1922 with Churchill. It repeated its role in 1937 with the Peel Commission in the effort to create a truncated Jewish state at the expense of the possibility of bringing millions of Jews and a larger Arab political entity between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. It was rejected not only by the Arabs, but also by Winston Churchill himself as a non-starter because of the damage it did to the national Jewish interests. Ben-Gurion accepted it because he understood where we were headed, perhaps in terms of the Holocaust and in terms of the evaporation of British support for partition. It repeated itself again after the Holocaust, the Second World War. Until today, partition has been the primary paradigm for how to to create political rights for both Jews and Arabs living in the Middle East, and particularly between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. And that brings us to where we are today. If you look at the perspective of the Israeli left, which has been in favor of partition since the onset, certainly since 1948, even earlier, they argue that Israel needs to have partition in order to make it possible for it to grant absolute equal rights to everyone living under its control, be it within pre-67 Israel, be it with any territory we hold onto in Judea and Samaria in the West Bank. The theory being, there should never be a situation where there are two parallel legal systems for the same population living under our control. That is our vision. That is what certainly the Israeli left speaks of, and to a large extent today, Israel in general. What is the challenge? The challenge, of course, is that that partition is totally rejected by a good proportion of the Palestinians, led by the Hamas and the Islamic Jihad, who expressed their opposition through means of violence, and that it's conditioned by the Palestinian Authority, the Fatah, the other Palestinian groups, as Israel's acceptance of an orthodoxy of partition means two states, means 67 borders, the division of Jerusalem, and the right of return. No other possible solution of partition is at all acceptable. When the Trump plan came up 2 years ago, it was rejected out of hand, even though the Trump plan also recognized ultimately the concept in the paradigm of partition as a way of solving the problem. A couple of years ago, I was in Bethlehem in meeting with a group of young Palestinians who asked me, what is your feeling about all of this?
Chuck, I'm going to slightly interrupt you there. I think you're going to have to wrap up if that's possible.
Okay, so I'll try to do it. And I said, I think you've become the victims and the hostages of a perspective that says there is only one answer. If we can't get all of our national goals, we don't want any of them. What's happened now, and I'll sum this up in 30 seconds, is that the Human Rights Watch and other actors have co-opted the language of race, the terminology of racism and apartheid, emptied it of its original meanings, which had to do with actual racism, actual apartheid, taken the term to define any system which allows there to be two types of populations with getting treated differently by a government, irrespective of the context, irrespective of the fact that Israel is engaged in a war against terror, irrespective of the fact that the Palestinian leadership, it holds its own people as hostages to its own militancy and fanaticism, and uses those words of apartheid and racism because they still...
Aspetta. Tu mi dici che i saranno soldi che devono essere pagati nel...
Hello?
Okay, you're okay, Yitzhak.
Okay, so I was saying the stench of those associated with those words, racism, apartheid, even when they're defined totally differently, right, still works. And what's happened is that we have players who are essentially saying, since we can't get a solution based on partition, we want to delegitimize the very fundamental concept of there being a Jewish state in the first place. That's the alternative to saying, why is the Hamas getting a free pass for acting as terrorists, or the Palestinian Authority for refusing to come to the negotiating table? And I'll leave it with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Yitzhak. Thank you so much. Now, I think we're going to move on. I don't see any questions in the chat box, but we would have time for one question. Is there anybody who has a question they'd really like to put to Yitzhak? Or Sarah, do you have anything that I haven't seen?
I don't, Andrew.
No. Okay. Any other burning questions out there? Okay. Well, hang around, Yitzhak, because we'll come to a Q&A at the end of the three sessions.
No
We're going to move on to Dr. Matthijs de Blois. Welcome, Dr. de Blois, and who will speak to us about the important period of time between the passing of the Balfour Declaration in 1917 up to the creation of the State of Israel. So how was Zionism, as it were, implemented, and how did it result in the Jewish State of Israel? Matthijs, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew. Yes, the question was posed, how was the State of Israel created? And some people assume that it was created by the United Nations. Other people think it was created because of the Shoah, of the Holocaust, but those answers do ignore the legal birth certificates of the State of Israel. And it was in 1897 that the first Congress of the World Zionist Organization formulated as its political ambition, the aim of Zionism is to create for the Jewish people a home in Palestine secured by public law. That was the purpose of the Zionist movement, and they were trying to find support for this ambition with the great powers of those days, Russia and Germany and even the Vatican, and also the British government. And there they could find support for the political aim of Zionism. And it was during the First World War that the British government had, in contact with the World Zionist Organization, formulated the so-called Balfour Declaration, which is a letter written by the Foreign Secretary after Balfour to Lord Rothschild as a representative of the Jewish community. And the letter said that His Majesty's government view with favor the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people, and will use their best endeavors to facilitate the achievement of this object, it being clearly understood that nothing shall be done which may prejudice the civil and religious rights of existing non-Jewish communities in Palestine, or the rights or political status enjoyed by Jews in any other country, unquote. And this Balfour Declaration, a unilateral declaration of the British government, can be seen as a starting point of this development towards the Jewish state of Israel. It was formulated, and at the same time, or some month later, approximately, the British Army, mainly composed of Australian and New Zealand soldiers, captured Jerusalem, and were received enthusiastically by the Jewish population. And on the 11th of December 1917, there was the official entry of General Allenby. And initially it was an occupied territory, but then the military authorities were replaced by a civil administration, anticipating the adoption of the mandate. And then we come to what happened after the First World War. The peace conference in Versailles and other places around Paris, one of the problems they had to solve was what to do with the territories and colonies of those vanquished countries, like, inter alia, the Ottoman Empire, which was already in decay. And the Versailles Treaty in 1919 created an international organization, the predecessor of the United Nations, the League of Nations. And within the covenant of the League of Nations, there was a provision to deal with these territories and colonies. And the approach was a new approach, inspired by the American President Woodrow Wilson. No longer the old traditional colonialism was to be continued, but there was created a system to help people and territories in a process of gradual development towards independence. And that is in Article 22 of the Covenant of the League of Nations. And that is the basis of the so-called mandate system, which was also relevant for the Ottoman Empire. In the fourth paragraph of Article 22, there is reference to the certain communities formerly belonging to the Turkish Empire. They have reached a state of development where their existence as independent nations can be provisionally recognized, subject to the rendering of administrative advice and assistance by a mandatory, until such time as they are able to stand alone. So there was the mandate system, and the Allied powers of those days, the victors of the First World War, Great Britain, France, Italy, and Japan, and there was also an associated power, the United Nations, the United States of America, and they convened in San Remo in 1920 as an extension of the Versailles Peace Conference to decide on the future of the Ottoman Empire. And they decided to create mandates for Mesopotamia, nowadays Iraq, Syria and the Lebanon, and also Palestine. And they decided that Britain should be the mandatory power of Palestine. And important is that in this resolution of San Remo, it was decided that the mandate should implement the Balfour Declaration. In other words, the creation of a Jewish national home in Palestine. And that's what happened in 1922. The mandate for Palestine was formulated, and Great Britain was appointed as the mandatory power. So it was not a colony, but it was a mandate. And the mandate for Palestine, if you compare it to other mandates, had a unique character for two reasons. First of all, having regard to the beneficiaries of this mandate for Palestine. The beneficiaries of the mandate are the Jewish people as such, not only the Jews living in the territory of Palestine, as was the case in the other mandates, people of Mesopotamia or Syria and the Lebanon or Rwanda, Burundi, they were the people living there and they were beneficiaries of the mandate. But in the case of the Palestine mandate, it was provided that the beneficiaries were the Jewish people as such, wherever they lived in the world. And that is clear from various articles of the mandate. The central provision is Article 2, which says that the mandatory shall be responsible for placing the country under such political, administrative and economic conditions that will secure the establishment of the Jewish national home and the development of self-governing institutions. And Article 6 of the mandate provided for the right of Jews to settle in the country and to facilitate Jewish immigration. Article 7 provided for the provision of Palestine, the acquisition of Palestine citizenship by Jews who take up their permanent residence in Palestine. And Article 4 of the mandate provides for the institution of a Jewish agency, and that was entrusted to the Jewish World Zionist Organization. So in many articles of the mandate made clear that there is a special character. This mandate has a very special character, and seeing the Jewish people as the beneficiaries. It refers the mandate to a Jewish national home, and not the formulation is not a Jewish state. But nevertheless, if we look into the history of the mandate and of the Balfour Declaration, it was clear that the intention was that eventually a Jewish independent state should emerge. The non-Jews living in Palestine were not overlooked in the mandate. There is a reference to the civil and religious rights in Article 2 of all the inhabitants of Palestine that notes civil and religious rights. Political rights were for the Jewish community to create an independent, to create a Jewish national home. And the ambitions and aspirations of the Arabs were addressed in other ways. As we see on the map, the original territory of the mandate extended to the eastern part of, or the eastern border of nowadays Jordan. But there was a provision in the mandate that made it possible for Britain to restrict its responsibilities for the creation of a Jewish national home to the part west of the Jordan River, so between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean. The eastern part was then created into or made into an emirate, an Arab emirate, under the Hashemite dynasty, and which eventually became the Kingdom of Transjordan. So there the aspirations of Arabs were met, and otherwise also the mandate for Syria and the Lebanon and the mandate for Mesopotamia addressed the self-determination of the Arab peoples. The mandate was also unique in another respect when we look at the powers of the mandatory. They had full powers of legislation and administration. That was different from the other mandates, and that was necessary to make it possible to create a national Jewish national home for the Jewish people. Otherwise, due to the opposition of the Arab population, that would never have been possible. What was the reason for this unique, what was the justification of this special character, the unique character? Well, two reasons are given in the preamble. First, the historical connection of the Jewish people with the territory. Yitzhak Sokolov has also already explained that. And secondly, the reasons for reconstituting their national home in that country. And that was explained by Lord Balfour when he had to defend the mandate against the opposition in the House of Lords. And he referred then to the persecution of Jews and threat of annihilation throughout Western history, the history in Christendom. And then he said, if we can do something about it, we should do it. So there were reasons for this unique character, the kind of sacred trust to the Jewish people as such. Well, then how was the mandate implemented? Well, if you look at that, there's a rather sad story. Almost from the beginning, there was a kind of, the British government tried to retreat from its obligations under the mandate. We see something already in the first white paper of Churchill, 1922, where a criterion was introduced for the immigration, economic capacity of the country, which is not in the mandate. Well, then the next white paper in 1930 of Parsfield, Lord Parsfield, it was suggesting that the obligations towards the Jews and the Arabs in the territory were identical, and they were not under the mandate, as we know. So, well, there was, of course, opposition against this view, and the Prime Minister MacDonald tried to appease the opponents, and by saying, well, we stick to the Balfour Declaration and the mandate, but nevertheless, gradually, step by step, and also because of the Arab opposition and revolt against the mandatory authorities, they tried to restrict the immigration of Jews to the territory more and more. Yitzhak Sokolov also referred to the Peel report about the partition of the mandate territory in a very small Jewish state and a larger Arab state, but that was rejected. And then in 1939, note the date, note the year during the Nazis had come to power in 1933, and they started already then the persecution and the suppression and eventually the extermination of the Jews. And in 1939, the British government adopted a new white paper, which was a kind of final death blow to the mandate and to the unique character of the mandate. And they said there will not be a Jewish state. They said the immigration has to be restricted very much to a number in the first 5 years, and after that be subjected to the approval of the Arab population. And so that did away of the main obligations under the mandate, and therefore it was strongly criticized by Churchill. For example, he said it is a breach of the promise made to the Jewish people, and also by the Permanent Mandates Commission of the League of Nations. It was highly criticized, and mind you, it was in the time 1939 when there was so much a need for a safe haven for the Jewish people, because they were persecuted in Europe, in Germany, and all the countries that became occupied or annexed by the Nazis.
Matthijs, for 3 more minutes.
3 more minutes, thank you. I will try to succeed. Yes, that is, yes. Well, we know what happened during the war, and the restrictions remained there also after 1939, and up until 1943. Then the British government became a little bit more lenient and made it possible for people to escape via Turkey to Palestine. But then for the great majority, it was too late, for many Jews had been murdered already. And even after the war, after the Second World War, the restrictions on the immigration to Palestine remained in force. It was very, very difficult. We know all the stories written about it. It was terrible. And then the British decided to terminate the mandate, their responsibilities under the mandate, and they could not find a solution. So they submitted the whole issue to the United Nations, and that adopted the General Assembly in 1947, the so-called partition plan, which provided for the partition of the territory, as you can see here on the map, in a small Jewish state and an Arab state, while Jerusalem should be internationalized and its surrounding area, and the whole territory should be form an economic union. The plan was forthwith rejected by the Arabs, and it was accepted by the Jews under the provision that the Arabs would also accept it. But it was forthwith rejected by the Arabs, not only the Arabs living in the territory, but also the Arab states. And there was already a lot of violence and struggle between Jews and Arabs in that period. And the British were preparing their departure by the 15th of May. And on the eve of that, on the 14th of May, 1948, the Ben-Gurion proclaimed the declaration of the establishment of the State of Israel. And that's the starting point of the modern State of Israel. It was a state, it had a territory, there was a population, and there was an effective government, even if it was at war, the war of independence. Finally, one remark about the legal relevance of what I have said. It's my view that the mandate is still relevant. And that is because of Article 80 of the UN Charter. That is a provision that provides for the transition from the mandate system under the League of Nations towards the new trusteeship system under the United Nations. So the mandate system was under the League of Nations and the trusteeship under the United Nations. And it said in Article 80 that except the agreement upon individual trusteeship agreements, nothing in this chapter of the Charter of the United Nations shall be construed in or of itself to alter in any manner the rights whatsoever of any states or any peoples, note that word, or the terms of existing international instruments to which the members of the United Nations may respectively be parties. So the rights of the peoples under the mandate should be respected. This clause has been called the Palestine Clause. It was to protect the rights of the Jewish people under the mandate. And so for that reason, even if there is no League of Nations anymore, the rights under the mandate are relevant. And I think they are relevant in legal terms because not the whole territory of the mandate is still the undisputed territory of the State of Israel. We have the disputes about the Judea, Samaria, the West Bank, Gaza. And in that debate, I think Article 80 is relevant to underline the relevance, the legal relevance of the mandate for Palestine, the birth certificate of the State of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Matthijs. That's been very interesting. We have a question from Hugh Kitson. I think everybody can see it. Matthijs, for you, how does one answer the argument by the Palestinians, especially Hamas, that Sharia law, which says that the Balfour Declaration and San Remo resolution are illegal, takes precedence over international law? Do we have a clash of civilizations? I might just add to that, that's a good question, Hugh. But they also argue that under international law, Balfour and San Remo are illegal because they say that the League of Nations mandate system was intended to be for the benefit of all the population of Palestine. And at that time, of course, 90% of the population were not Jews. So on that ground as well, they argue that the whole idea of a Jewish particular preference is in conflict with international law. So really two aspects. Do you have an answer to that, Matthijs?
Yes, the first was the conflict with Sharia law. I think that is difficult to solve in that respect. That is the religious law of the Islamic community. I'm not sure. Well, it is seen as a conflict. While I think there are also Islamic sources that say that the Jews are to live in the land of Israel. But as to the conflict with the international law, I think it's about the interpretation of the mandate and Article 22 of the League of Nations. I underline that the mandate for Palestine has indeed a unique character. it is, in fact, seeing the Jewish people all over the world as virtually being inhabitants of Palestine. I think that's a unique character, if you interpret it like that. And that was the way it was interpreted by the body which, according to international law, was to implement the mandate system. And that was the Council of the League of Nations. And they formulated the mandate. So they were empowered by the Article 22 of the Covenant to implement the obligations under the mandate system. And they said, well, we accept this unique situation where there's very strong justifications for that, having regard to history. And we accept that unique character by adopting the mandate. So I think, having regard to the system, the League of Nations, combined with the powers of the Council of the League of Nations, and the text of the mandate, I think you can defend it as being in conformity with international law. Also having regard to the fact that the aspirations of the Arab people were met in various ways. I pointed at the separation of the mandate territory in favor of the creation of an Arab emirate east of the Jordan. And I pointed at the other mandates addressing the Arab self-determination, like the mandate for Syria and Lebanon and the mandate for Mesopotamia, Iraq.
Thank you, Matthijs. So obviously this is, legally speaking, a huge topic. It's interesting, we're involved with the proceedings at the International Criminal Court at the moment, and a lot of the submissions that are made from the, let's say, the pro-Palestinian side, they always overlook this specific Jewish aspect of the mandate. And interestingly, even the International Court of Justice in 2004, when it talks about the mandate in one short paragraph, it says nothing whatsoever about this idea that the mandate was intended for the establishment of a Jewish homeland. So it's almost like it's kind of being erased from our collective legal memory. We'll come back to that later. I'd like to thank you, Matthijs. And we'll move on to our next speaker, Professor Amichai Cohen, Senior Fellow and Director of the Program on National Security and Democracy at the Israel Democracy Institute in Jerusalem. He's a Professor of International Law at the Ono Academic College, a graduate of Hebrew University and Yale Law School. And he's going to speak to us about the Jewish state of Israel. Amichai, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Andrew, and thanks for having me for thinc. And I have a difficult task in front of me. First of all, because I'm the last speaker in this session. So, Andrew, how much time do I have?
We have 20 minutes, Amichai.
20 minutes. And I'll try to be exact in my time. And also because it's a hard act to follow after Yitzhak and Matthias giving this wide range of perspective regarding the issue. I apologize, I'm a lawyer. I look at the specific text and I'll try to speak today about the more specific Jewish and democratic identity of the current state of Israel. So moving from historical views since Abraham, I'll be very, I think, current. So I'll just try and share my screen, and please let me know if it works and if you can see. Just a second.
That seems to be working.
Just a second here. I think, just a second. Okay, is this good, Andrew?
Yes, that's very good, Amichai.
Okay, so I'm just, okay, I'll go to the first. Okay, so Israel is described as a Jewish and democratic state. Where is it stated that it's a Jewish and democratic state? Well, one source, I think the major legal source for this definition is Basic Law, Human Liberty and Dignity. I apologize for the typo at the heading. Well, Israel does not have a constitution. I asked Andrew beforehand if you went over the constitutional basics of Israel. He said no. I said I'll need an hour and a half to explain. But so we'll just skip over this issue. Israel does not have a formal constitution. It does, however, have basic laws which have an elevated status according to Israeli law. And the most important basic law is, or perhaps one of the most important basic laws, is Basic Law, Human Liberty and Dignity. It says explicitly the purpose of this basic law is to protect human dignity and liberty in order to establish in a basic law the values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So here we have enshrined in the basic law the idea that Israel is a Jewish and democratic state. What does it mean, a Jewish and democratic state? What we know, I think, what is a democracy, or at least we have some idea, although, of course, there are, just a second, sorry, there are discussions, but we can perhaps agree for the sake of our discussion here that democracy is defined by a democratic procedure and protection of some rights, at least rights with regards to the process of elections. So we know something about democracy. But what does it mean to have a Jewish state? What does it mean that the state is Jewish? Well, we can think about at least three meanings of a Jewish state. One is simply that there is a Jewish majority in the state of Israel. So most of the inhabitants of the state of Israel are Jews. So this is correct. About 80% of the inhabitants of Israel proper, I'm not speaking about the territories right now, are Jews. Of course, there is a discussion, what does it mean exactly to be Jewish, but let's leave it aside for a second. This is correct. The second meaning is self-determination of the nation state as a self-determination of the Jewish people. Is it an exclusive self-determination of the Jewish people? What exactly does it mean? This is a topic I'll discuss later. A third meaning, of course, and one which we will not discuss today, is a state that's run according to Jewish law. Okay, so there are Jewish values, specific, perhaps even Jewish law, which is the basic law of the Jewish state. Now, of course, if you adopt the first definition of a Jewish state, I think that there is no tension between democracy and a Jewish state. Of course, once there is a Jewish majority, then there is no tension with democracy. The third meaning might lead to tensions. So the idea of Jewish law as the law of the country might lead to some tensions with democracy. This is not the topic of my talk today. You will have to invite me, Andrew, to a different lecture if you want to understand the tensions between Jewish law and democracy in the modern state of Israel. This is not the topic. The third meaning is the meaning I want to speak about, is the Jewish nation state. Now, there are three potential tensions between Israel as a Jewish state, or the nation state of the Jewish people, and democracy. Three potential tensions. One is equality. So do non-Jews have equal rights in Israel? The second potential is prohibition on tension. So what happens if the majority of people within the state of Israel want to change this identity? Either because the majority is non-Jewish, or because somehow the majority decides it does not want this definition of the Jewish nation state. Can they change it? And the third potential tension between Jewish and democratic is that the minority does not feel that it's their country. So the national anthem, the flag, I would call it, there is no Republican citizenship. So even if they have formal citizenship, the Arabs or the non-Jews within the state of Israel, do they have full citizenship? Can they think about themselves as part of the country? So three potential tensions, and I'll try very shortly to speak about how the Israel confronted these three potential tensions. And I, as a lawyer, I'll speak mainly, although not exclusively, to the decisions of the Israeli Supreme Court, which dealt and confronted these tensions in several decisions. So let's speak about the first tension, and it's equality. And I must say, the Israeli Supreme Court dealt with the issue of the Jewish and democratic states from many aspects. Many of them internal Jewish, between Orthodox and Reform Jews, between the Jewish law, secular and religious Jews. But this is not my perspective once again here today. I'm just speaking about the Jewish and democratic character of the state of Israel with regards to the Arab minority and the way the court dealt with it. So once again, the first tension, the problem of equality. So the issue came before the Israeli Supreme Court in many cases, but perhaps the most important case is the Kaadan versus Israel Land Administration case of 2000, where the Jewish agency, which is a semi-governmental agency within Israel, which owns land in Israel, and with support of the Israel Land Administration Agency, were built a settlement village that refused to accept Arabs, as they didn't sell land. You had to buy a lot of land, and Arabs were not allowed to buy a lot of land. The claim was that Jews are allowed to build a village of their own. And before the Supreme Court, the claim was this is part of the Jewish identity of the state. And the court said, this is one of the most important decisions of Justice Aaron Barak, who was then the president of the Supreme Court. You have some of the text before you, but I'll just read the last paragraph. However, the values of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state do not by any means suggest that the state will discriminate between its citizens. Both Jews and non-Jews are citizens with equal rights and duties in the state of Israel. So the court was very clear. Of course, it's not the first decision, it's not the last decision. Perhaps it's the most important decision of the court in this issue. In terms of equality, formal citizenship, there is no discrimination between Jews and Arabs, and discrimination here, the court emphasized, there is also no separate but equal. Okay, so the non-discrimination here also means non-separation. So in terms of the equal rights of the Arabs or non-Jews living in Israel, they have exactly the same rights. The state is not allowed to discriminate in any way or manner. So this is regarding the first tension, potential tension, the equality of citizens. Now the second tension is, what about the identity of Israel? Can it be changed? And the tension is especially acute in the elections. So there were parties, Arab parties, or some of the Arab parties, when they come to the elections, they present their policies, and some of them are, we want to democratically change the identity of the state of Israel from the Jewish state to a state which belongs to all its citizens, not necessarily Jewish. And the Knesset passed the law to an amendment to basic law of the Knesset, which is once again a basic law, so it's part of the more hierarchically elevated level. A candidate list shall not participate in election to the Knesset, etc. One, negation of the existence of the state of Israel as a Jewish and democratic state. So if a party wants to change the identity of the state of Israel, this party cannot run in elections. Potentially, there is a tension here between the Jewish and democratic identity of the state of Israel, because a party cannot run to the Knesset when its platform specifically said that it wants to change the identity of the state of Israel. The reason I'm bringing it up is because up until now, not even one party was not allowed to run in the elections based on this specific article. There were parties that were not allowed to run to the election on the second, incitement to racism. This was a reason that the court accepted as a reason not to allow parties to run for the election. Also, support for armed struggle was also something the court was willing to accept. But the court, I won't go into the cases, we don't have time, but the court was very, very clear on its interpretation that in order for not allowing a party to run to the elections based on the first reason, negation of the Jewish of the democratic state, there has to be the party has to support violence in order to do it, not simply to support it. The court, and it was heavily criticized for it, but the court was very persistent in its interpretation that almost every party, even if its platform hints at negation of the existence, then should be allowed. Existence as a Jewish and democratic state should be allowed. Once again, the court here, in a sense, solved this tension. And the third tension is the idea of belonging. So is this a country that, if it's a country that belongs to the Jewish people, what do the non-Jews think about it? So is it also their country in the sense? The question came to a clear discussion very recently in a 2018 basic law, Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people. It was passed in 2018. And this law states explicitly, and you have before you the first article, the land of Israel is the historical homeland of the Jewish people in which the state of Israel was established. Of course, after hearing the eloquent presentations of Yitzhak and Matthias, you now know the background for this. The state of Israel is the nation state of the B, Article 1b. The state of Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, in which it realizes its natural, cultural, religious, and historical right to self-determination. And 1c, the exercise of the right to national self-determination in the state of Israel is unique to the Jewish people. So 2 points here, and these were claims that were brought, and I will immediately speak about it in the 2 or 3 minutes that I have left. The question here is, does this article create some kind of discrimination against the non-Jews in Israel? So what does it mean? Article 1b, that it's the nation state of the Jewish people, and as you see, 1c, it's the exclusive nation state of the Jewish people. Only Jews can claim that Israel is their nation state. And the question came before the court. There were petitions to the court claiming that there are further provisions. I don't have to go. I don't have time to go into it. You can see the law itself and ask yourselves regarding the language. It's Hebrew, regarding settlement of Jews in the state. There are other provisions that were brought to the court in the petition, but Article 1 is the major reason for the petition. And the claim was that by Article 1, the non-Jews are excluded from thinking about Israel as their country. So the question of Republican citizenship we talked about earlier. Now, there is a problem in bringing the petition to the court. So it's actually the claim here that somehow the basic law is non-constitutional, which is a catch-22, because how can a constitution be non-constitutional? There is discussion in some of the discussion in the decision of the Supreme Court, which was just handed down this last summer. Okay, the decision is from July 2021. So President Chayut, the president of the Supreme Court, said, this is paragraph 27 of the decision,
Have we lost Amichai there?
Amichai is freeze.
He's frozen. Yeah, it's very cold there in Israel.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let's see what happens. While we're waiting for Amichai to unfreeze, I'm going to put a question to Matthijs from Shufeng. Matthijs, if you're still there. Were there any Arab representatives at the San Remo conference? And did they object to the British mandate and their commitment to the Balfour Declaration? So, yeah, the San Remo conference, were the Arabs represented?
The Arabs were, well, it was a conference of the Allied and associated powers. So I'm not sure whether either the Arabs or the Zionist movement was represented there. They were represented in the Versailles, the General Peace Conference in Paris. There were both representatives of the Zionist movement and of the Arabs. But I'm not sure about San Remo. I have to look it up, but it was their conference of those powers who had to decide on the future of the Ottoman Empire. And as far as, well, I'm not sure whether they were as a kind of observers there. I have to.
Andrew?
There is our colleague.
I'm sorry, Andrew, I was disconnected, but you have to remind me until when, I don't know, how long did I speak to myself?
Okay, so you were just explaining President Chayut's decision, and you just started that explanation.
Okay, so just a second. I'm sorry, I apologize for that mishap. Okay, so this slide, right?
Yep.
Okay, so I'll just a second here. Okay, so President Chayut was saying, and I'll just skip over what I spoke to myself earlier, is that there is a nucleus of identity to the country, and it's a Jewish and democratic identity of the country, and specifically with regards to Article 1 which I stated earlier, okay, is that regarding the state of Israel as the nation state of the Jewish people, President Chayut said the following, and I think this is an important statement by the court. I believe that the purposive interpretation of section 1C of the Basic Law on Nationality leads to the conclusion that this section does not deal with the right to internal self-determination or the group rights of minority in Israel, and therefore cannot be considered a section that denies such rights in principle. So President Chayut is explicit in her interpretation. So indeed, as an external matter, Israel is the nation state of the Jewish people, meaning Israel is allowed, for example, to prefer Jews in entrance. So the law of national return, right? So the Jews have preference in entering Israel. But once within Israel, there is no preference to any group, to the Jews over the Arabs. So the groups within Israel are equal, not only in their specific rights, but also as groups. And in conclusion, I don't want to say that there are no tensions between the Jewish and democratic identity of the state of Israel. But it's important, the statement of Justice Chayut in paragraph 40. The foundations of Israel evolving constitution, the Jewish identity and the democratic identity exist side by side, without one canceling out the other or overcoming the other. Notwithstanding the fact that tensions might arise between these principles, these are complementing and mutually supplementing principles. Thank you very much. And I apologize once again for being disconnected for a second there.
No problem, no need to apologize. Thank you, Amichai, so much for that. Okay, people, I'm conscious we are running a little bit over time. I'm quite understand if people need to leave, but we will continue with a few questions and answers. And I'm going to jump straight into you, Amichai, with a question from Hans Peter. What is the status of the Arab language? The media like to attack Israel, saying that Arabic has officially disappeared or is regarded as a secondary.
No, that's not.
So the law indeed says that Hebrew is the official language of Israel, but it specifically accorded Arabic a special status, and it's also explicitly said that the principled claim that Hebrew is the formal language does not in any way negate any use of the Arab language as was previously understood. What it means, and this is the way the court interpreted it, that this is more a cultural statement, like the flag of the Jewish state, the national anthem. The fact that Hebrew is the formal language represents the general cultural identity of the state. It does not in any way infringe on the rights of Arabs to use their language in any formal or informal interactions with any state agency or in education or in any way.
Okay, thank you. Before we move on to the next question, I mean, we see a lot of riots going on, don't we, in Israel at the moment? It seems that a lot of the Arabs, well, I don't know whether these riots are related to this, but it seems to me many Arabs don't feel particularly at home or respected in their Arab identity. Is that a true, fair comment or not?
It cannot be denied. It should not be denied that during the existence of the State of Israel, the 70-something years of existence, there was discrimination against, I'm not speaking about now the Palestinians in the territories, I'm saying within Israel, there was discrimination. The previous government, it cannot be denied because it's a fact of reality. It's not, I think there is almost no one who disputes this. This was in terms of budgetary means, education, entry into the workforce. In the past, I would say, decade or decade and a half, all governments, right-wing or left-wing, have done immense attempts to rectify this situation. It will take time, but for example, just the last budget that was passed promises enormous amounts of money intended to rectify some of it. And once again, I'm not, a political scientist. I'm a lawyer. The law here, I think, went before reality in terms that equality was clear before in law for 3 or 4 decades. It is now becoming, I believe, also reality. If one claims of specific discrimination, there might be, a specific truth to it. But I think immense efforts are being made to, including preferential treatment of Arabs in government service, for example, in recruiting them for government service, etc. Once again, I'm not trying to justify that there was no discrimination along the history of Israel. There was, but this, I think, is now changing.
Well, it's a huge topic, and I think, Amichai, we're going to have to invite you back for a session just on this topic. I'm going to move on. We'll have, I think, maybe, do we have time, Aryeh, for a couple of questions?
Andrew, can I relate to that issue?
Yeah, sure, Yitzhak.
And I'd just like to point out the dilemma. If we look at Israel proper, the population is about 81% Jewish and about 19% Arab. Were this to be France, all of the Arab kids would end up going to Jewish schools. That would be to say, in schools where the curriculum is a regular Jewish Israeli curriculum conducted in Hebrew. In reality, Israel has done everything in order not to become a melting pot, not to deny Arabs, Israeli Arabs, the right to cherish and perpetuate their own culture, in particular in the framework of an independent school system. If in America we have the concept of separate but equal being a destructive element, in Israel, the provision of the possibility for the Arab population of having its own school system is actually something else entirely. It's welcomed by the Arab and embraced by the Arab community. But the results are that we end up with 2 groups of people with different cultural identities. So for an Arab living in a majority Jewish environment, in which the language on the street is Hebrew, and in which the economy and military issues and the stories that you see in the newspapers every day reflect that majority culture, there is a sense of alienation, perhaps disenfranchisement. Now, it's done in a sense to preserve and to, out of respect for Arab culture, but the result is that level of tension, which when you add to it sometimes economic issues, which are not necessarily a function of this, but they are connected for cultural reasons, then the result can be tensions that explode. And this past May, we saw terrible explosions, the worst we've seen in Israel for the last 70 years. And we need to look at them in depth to try to figure out how do you create a society that does provide equality in terms of the access to the legal system, to the economic system, at the same time provides the ability for each minority group to maintain its own culture without getting to alienation. It's very hard. It requires the Arabs to have a split identity, and it's not a simple matter.
Thanks, Yitzhak. Yeah. David, are you still there? You had your hand up. Or has David left us? Okay. A question from Varpu in Finland. It's about the settlements. Proponents of the Israeli apartheid claim often point out that there are settlements in Israel that do not accept everyone as their inhabitants and have been given the right to do so. Okay, so this is a very different topic. It's about the territories and settlements. Amichai, can you comment on that?
I think there are two issues here. If one speaks about the settlements, villages within Israel proper, then, as I pointed out, discrimination is forbidden by law. And in fact, one of the points, as Yitzhak, I think, spoke about, many of the riots in the summer in Israel were in these in these neighborhoods where Jews and Arabs live side by side. So in a lot of towns and cities in Israel, there is a joint. In the territories, it's much more complicated, and it includes not only the question of national identity, but also of citizenship. So the question is Israeli citizens living in the territories and Palestinians, non-Israeli citizens. And they do not live in the same areas even. And I don't think we can, Andrew, go into this issue if you want at length, but it's a different question altogether. It has to do with the legality of settlements, with the idea of Israelis living in the territory. So there are questions there that need to be discussed, but perhaps not in a...
I think you're right. And it is a very complicated topic. We will deal with it to some extent in the next session. We're going to talk about the two-state idea, partition, and I think the whole issue of settlements will come up next week. Aryeh, I'm conscious we've reached the end of our time. So I'd like to hand back to you. There are many more questions in the chat box. We haven't had a chance to deal with them. I'm sorry. But we will try and pick up on some of them in future sessions. And it just shows that we need to come back to some of these issues with separate dedicated sessions dealing with more issues. I'd like to just close by inviting everybody to our next session, which is on the 10th of November. And we will talk about the two-state solution and the idea of partition, which we learned today is nothing new. Partition's been on the table for 100 years. But what's the current status? What is the thinking behind it? Does Palestine exist as a state or not? So you will discover many things on the 10th of November. And thank you to our speakers for your wonderful contribution. Thank you so much. Back to you, Aryeh.
Thank you all. And I recall that this program is open to all those that would like to participate. So if you like this platform and this project, please bring your friends with you next time. And also, we have the replay of all our conferences. So you will find them. We will send it to all the people. So you will be able to go back to everything that was said. And we will be happy to meet you next time. Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody. And we'll see you next time.